culture, I think for me, is absolutely everything. You can have the shiniest tools out there, but if you haven't got the right engaged workforce and executive team that are driving the culture of the organization to use those tools in the right way, then there's no surprises that so much transformation fails.
Very good morning to all of you. Welcome to another episode of Retention Voices by SentiSum. I'm Vivek Ganotra. I'm one of the co-founders of SentiSum, a business that we created a few years ago with this very clear intention to reshape the narrative around the voice of customer with a particular obsession on how we can move the needle on customer retention. It is a beautiful sunny day here in London. I say that because it has been quite gloomy in the last few days. So the sun's out here, and it's a nice crisp morning. And thank you for joining us from various parts of the world, and particularly our guests, who have joined us, and people who have also registered from in early hours from the US. So first and foremost, I'd love to welcome my two guests on today's webinar, Carole and Richard. Good morning to both of you.
Morning.
Good morning.
So Carole and Richard both are just amazing practitioners and particularly have a real passion on this topic, and which is why they're here to share some of their thoughts. Carole's had an amazing career across household names, banking giants like Barclays and Nationwide, and then also has spent time in the technology world, seen it from the other side from companies like Salesforce and Medallia. And Richard's an amazing and experienced transformation leader, has worked across various organizations until recently was Chief Customer Officer at BNP Paribas. So truly honored to have this collective experience spanning decades of real practitioner experience and scars of what works and what doesn't work. And the topic we're going to explore today is a topic that's close to my heart as well. It's a cliche statement that the late Peter Drucker sort of invented many decades ago, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think in the world of outstanding customer experience, it still remains true that culture, in my view, is the kind of red thread that joins good CX strategy, good process, good organization structure, good tooling, including lots of dollops of AI in it. But while understood, is still underestimated in terms of what it takes to execute well in organizations to really make it that red thread. And this is something that I'd love to explore today with both of you, Carole and Richard. And if I can invite you, Carole, to sort of open up and just share your thoughts on this headline topic we have of culture in CX being the missing engine for retention.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Thank you. So thank you for having me this morning. Absolutely delighted to be here. And for those who are on the call that do know me, and Richard and I also used to work together in a former life as well, we are both incredibly passionate about this, because culture, I think for me, is absolutely everything. You can have the shiniest tools out there, but if you haven't got the right engaged workforce and executive team that are driving the culture of the organization to use those tools in the right way, then there's no surprises that so much transformation fails. So for me, when it comes to embedding customer experience and that culture in your organization, you need to make sure the customer outcomes are a core part of your strategy. The KPIs, the decision-making rituals, it has to be absolutely weaved through everything that you do. I think using real customer evidence, that could be journeys, insights, verbatums in meetings, to make sure you're anchoring those decisions in reality. And building a customer experience capability through everything that you do, through your training, your playbooks, and make sure that there's like clear ownership, I think, throughout the teams. In many organizations that I've either worked in or been party to when I've done some of my consultancy work, you often see that people have a little tick to say, oh yes, I'm interested in that, but it has to be core in everything and for everybody's team. And I'm not just talking about the customer facing colleagues, I'm talking about the people in your finance team and your HR teams. It has to be threaded through. I think you need to bring your colleagues on that journey as well. So involve them really, really early in what does that mean for them as an individual and the part that they'll play towards that. And again, it's not just the customer facing teams, it's people that do the journey mapping, the problem solving, the complaints team, the product team. How can you translate everything, those goals, into everything that matters for each of those functions? It's great to be able to show and demonstrate some quick wins, visible proofs of value to build the momentum. You should be celebrating that success. And make sure you're communicating consistently some really simple narratives and stories about this is what we did before. As a result of this change, this is what we're doing after. A really good example that I've used in one of the organisations that I did work in for many years is that we had a colleague platform that enabled our colleagues to be able to contribute in terms of what do they think is going wrong with the organisation, what are their ideas to make the organisation better, what's going wrong with any of the products, the processes. So all of our colleagues were able to engage. Then the colleagues were then able to vote in terms of what's the biggest friction that they're maybe seeing, or what was the idea that the colleagues liked the most. They would then go to the executive committee. And of course, you couldn't say yes to everything, but the ones that really we believe were going to make the biggest outcome for customers, they're the ones that absolutely used to get the funding and therefore would make sure that they would get fixed. Then go back to the colleagues, going back to that narrative is to make sure that they are truly engaging and make sure that the colleagues know that they are being listened to and that they're doing something about it. So that's a beautiful cultural example where lots of different people are involved, from the most junior to the most senior, because they want to get the right outcomes for the customer. And I think the final thing, and I guess it's something to watch out for, is breaking the loudest voice wins dynamic. I'm sure many of the people listening on today's calls have been in those meetings where somebody might be a bit more bullish, be a bit more confident in what they're presenting. We need to make sure that the decisions that are being made in the organisation are based on structured decision frameworks. Making sure it's what the customers absolutely want and need, what the colleagues are telling you is needed by our customers, and then make sure as a result of that you're not having that loudest voice or the highest paced person in the organisation that's making those decisions. So making sure that you're being able to bring quantitative and qualitative customer data to make sure that you counter out that anecdotal feedback that you often get in those board meetings and exco meetings. Establish clear prioritization, make sure it's agreed across functions, because again, you can get that friction between maybe the finance department and the product team or the customer team. And then I guess facilitate those meetings with an equal voice techniques, round robins, voting, the example I used earlier, to make sure that you reduce those dominants. So some of those, they're the things to watch out for. But if you can get that, that's a really lovely framework for getting a great culture on customer experience within your organisation. Rich, I don't know if you wanted to add anything onto that at all. Is there, from your perspective?
I think you're quite right. A lot of what you've said there, I've experienced myself, from very large organizations down to small startups. I think it's really important that senior leaders sometimes, who set the tone, but the customers hear the echo of what you do, are listening to the feedback from both their own people and their customers. So, it's one of my favorite expressions: leaders set the tone, customers hear the echo, which is basically a way of saying if the leaders set the wrong tone, the customers experience a bad result as a consequence of it. And it's interesting, Stephen put the first poll in around what people use for data. And it's interesting, everybody voted for you use a mix of data and insight and feedback. The reality is, and I'll be the first to admit this, when I've come across this in organizations, that's not always the case. And trying to wrangle that in organizations where you are listening to feedback rather than the loudest voice around the room is a key challenge and a skill you need to acquire when navigating the treacle in large scale businesses. And remember what you're trying to achieve.
Makes sense.
I love the examples and the anecdotes, and I'm going to say this phrase, Richard. Leader sets the tone, customers hear the echo. It rings so true.
Yeah, and again, I didn't invent it. It may have been Peter Drucker or somebody far more important than I am or smarter. But it's one of those things that just in those words, it sort of sets the tone why leadership, particularly when it's regards to AI and customers, is so important. It's so important.
Absolutely. And Richard, sort of staying with that throw. You've had such an amazing journey as a commercial leader, right? While staying true to and being passionate about customers and CX, and building on what you said, as you think about bridging the gap between having these great insights and driving good commercial execution, can you share your perspectives on how does one bridge that gap and accelerate it?
Yeah, so this is plainly what I've built a career on over the last 25, 30 years, which is, I've worked for some very large organizations and small ones where it's been somewhat intimidating. I'll be very honest with you. I've sat around the table with very smart people who've got Oxford, Harvard, Stanford, and Yale degrees, and then little old me who went to Warsaw College of Technology. But the reality is these very smart people have some really great ideas and strategies. But in my experience, sometimes they forget the basics. So, and again, that sounds very simplistic, but also I like looking at simple things in simple ways because it enables you to cut through. So, for example, working for a large scale bank, we talk about, the strategy for our self-service was X and we needed to achieve Y. The reality was that migration, when they talked about the technology, throughout the conversation, we hadn't talked about the education and training and cultural change required to allow the staff in store, for example, to be the advocate of migrating that technology. So it's not good enough to stick the technology with a label on it saying it does X, paying your cash here, for example. How do you get the people who are wandering around the shop floor to become advocates of it and they become agents of change in store as well as the customer themselves? But in my experience, and Peter Drucker coined the phrase, I describe it as most strategies don't survive the first encounter with execution. What tends to happen is you've got to adjust as you go through it. So I've written a few comments here, and this is just my experience where, don't be afraid to push back. These very smart and super bright people who, as Carole described, the hierarchy sometimes discourages people from challenge. In my experience, you've got to go back and say, can I just check your strategy is X? Can we just check, your strategy is X, but are you trying to achieve Y? And I'm one of these unusual people that is very comfortable with change. And not everybody is. And that's the other thing to remember. It may well be most practitioners on this call like change, enjoy change. There's one bit of advice I'd give everybody on this call: spend more time taking the people with you on that journey of change. I'm comfortable with the endpoint not being that fixed. A lot of people are not. And particularly with AI, which is causing issues around what's going to happen to my job, what's this going to mean for the skills I've got today, what's the environmental impact going to be? That's even more important and brings that into sharp relief. But understanding and test the strategy is the first point I would make. The second one, prioritization of the insights. You've got insights, but some are more relevant than others, particularly when you've got the insight that's produced a strategy, but the insight about how you then execute it, in what way, what do you do when, which bits come first, what's the sequence of events, that's almost as important as making sure the strategy you're doing from day one works as well. And, Carole does a better job at this than I, and she's very good at this, but connecting people to the vision. What's the purpose, vision, and mission of what you're trying to achieve? And working for an organization where it's owned by its members, for example, like a credit union or building society, that becomes even more important. You've got to take those people with you, otherwise that resistance to change is enormous. And it's like trying to pull on a Chinese finger puzzle. You don't really get anywhere without taking the people with you, explaining what are you doing, why you're doing it, and the impact and what it's going to be. Again, that becomes even more important when you're talking about AI and the potential impact. The latest numbers from Davos last year said that by 2027, they think over a quarter of people's jobs will be impacted in white collar jobs and will change from what they are today. And therefore, for me, from a change perspective, I did a speech recently at a fintech conference down in Bristol. And my premise was one of the most important people around the table is going to be your chief people officer, because they're going to help you change what people do, look at what talent you have today, how you bring a density of talent in from a change and AI and also technology, and how you're going to reskill people from what they do today and help them on that transition. And again, Carole touched upon this, but integrated communications and engagement. How do you keep people motivated and celebrate the milestones? As well as, is your business ready for change? Change is quite tough. And I alluded to a business owned by its customers and also a business owned by its shareholders. But the commonality is the business ready to accept that change? Does it have the structure? Does it have the right leadership in place to enable that to happen? And also, are you very clear what the decision makers are and who they are? And again, I've done this when it actually was a design of a branch, but I've done it when it's designing a process or a system or a technology. You cannot design that by committee. What are the different layers? Who has decision rights? Where do you go back and check? How do you make sure you keep the organization informed? Having multiple voices and then filtering and sifting through that becomes a full-time job if you're not clear about the hierarchy of decision, but also you're not clear about how you are engaging. If you create a vacuum of silence without updating people on the progress of projects, then you end up people asking questions, which can become incredibly frustrating for them because you haven't stakeholder mapped them correctly, and incredibly frustrating for you because it takes time. And this one is a key one. And again, forgive me, it's like teaching a lot of you around about how people think about what you're trying to achieve. But I've worked on some projects in some of the smaller organizations where they haven't been clear about the KPIs. And AI, I've consulted with a couple of businesses, I've spoken to a number of colleagues, and a little bit like the early noughties, where AI or digital as it was then, or the internet, becomes an excuse for not being clear about what your fiscal disciplines are. So how much are you investing? What are you trying to achieve? And what are the outcomes you're going to measure? And I heard this on the radio a few days ago. It's a Evan David podcast called The Bottom Line. If you haven't listened to it, I recommend it. But in the short term, history teaches us that new technology tends to be overinvested in and overestimated. In the medium term, the great news is it tends to be underinvested in and underestimated. And I think you can make your own judgment about where we are with AI. But the disciplines around running successful change programs and strategies about bridging that gap, which is understanding the insight, prioritization of those insights, connecting people, integrating the comms, ensure the decisions rights are correct, and measuring outcomes that matter, that you share and update constantly, are very, very clear and are consistent with AI now.
Love it, Richard. And there's so many interesting points and messages about starting with strategy, not necessarily having an end point. Thinking about sequencing very intentionally, thinking about taking people on the journey. As I reflect on it, I feel like in our years of experience, a lot of this feels like structured common sense, but yet underappreciated in terms of the hard yards to execute. Again, because you're talking about people and you're talking about really taking the natural resistance to change and the unknowns. But thank you. I think the insights across what both of you shared, I think, are worth reflecting on. Just remind our listeners as well that we will actually share a full recording of today's episode with you, so that you can listen back and take notes from there. As Richard, as you've sort of dropped the words that of AI into it in your narrative, I'm going to now sort of lean into that a little bit more, with a particular sort of intention. It's not about talking about AI in general. I'm talking in the context of everyone's talking about the pace of change that is coming in AI. I truly believe it's the most rebellious technology in our lifetime. Yet the reality is, particularly in established enterprise, there is a real question mark around AI adoption, right? And it probably, again, my hypothesis again probably comes back to the fundamentals of how you do things. It's not necessarily about good tooling versus bad tooling, etc. While I do feel like these days it's just so noisy. If you're on the buying side, who do you listen to? Because everyone's now overnight turned into a AI company, is what I often frame as far too much lipstick on the pig, and to kind of cut through that to really find meaningful partners. But the more important question is, as an enterprise, how do you actually think about AI adoption? How do you think about that curve? How do you think about the foundations? I love your thoughts on this topic, and then at the back of this, there's an interesting question come from one of our listeners as well that I'll bring into the conversation.
Carole, would you like me to kick off, or?
You go for it, Rich.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and a lot of this, perhaps I'm going to repeat myself somewhat. I make no apology for that, what I covered around bridging that gap, because I think for me, AI, the biggest thing as I talk to organizations and people and colleagues that I've worked with over the years, is a little bit of, and again, I'll mix my platitudes and metaphors here, and I make no apology for that because some of them are quite funny. But I think a lot of people nod their head and smile nicely about AI without really understanding it. And there's a couple of examples where I've talked to large businesses where somebody senior, and again, this covers off Carole's point about the loudest voice in the room, has had a conversation with somebody at a conference or a course or a networking session, and they've come back and they've gone, "We need AI. I need that. I need the AI." Or whatever they've come back with that. And I think there is a little piece here where the serious part of that is people need to understand what AI is. You need to understand, what you want to use it for and how it can make a difference to your business. I think Jodie's put some brilliant questions in about, what customer pain point will not be solved by AI. And that's a really good point. AI is not going to be the panacea for everything. It's not the silver bullet. In fact, if your processes are not very good, putting AI into it could potentially make it worse. So you need to be very clear about what AI is for your particular sector, whether that's financial services or whether that's going to be any other sector. I've worked in telcos and retail and a startup. What are you trying to achieve? What is it going to do for you? And it could be helping you with customer insight and data. It could be, helping with decision-making process. It could be, one of the best ones I've seen was vulnerable customers, about helping them further upstream before they get into persistent debt, helping them understand how they can do their finances in a way where it assists them to fill a format and create a budget plan, where sometimes that lack of understanding about their finances, because we don't do a great job in this country sometimes about explaining what financial education is, could help them do that. But I think answering Jodie's question, I'm going to go slightly off pat here. But what's it not going to solve? I think what it's not going to solve for me is it's not going to solve everything, but it's not going to give you the empathy and authenticity that sometimes people want, and giving customers choices about how they deal with your organization, rather than you can only go through a AI or a chatbot, or in old money you can only go through the telephone robot. Is the wrong thing to do. You need to think about, what does empathy and adoption look like, and understanding of your customer and personalization. AI can help with some of that. I don't think it can help with all of it. There was a really good interview, if you check it out, by the Chief Customer Officer of Zurich Insurance, who talked very much about this. It's on LinkedIn. Please have a look. But for me, going back to AI and adoption, I think, the adoption of AI, it's, let's be clear what it is, make sure everybody understands what it is, make sure that your team in this case, and I mentioned it earlier, there are unique things about AI, about it can affect everybody's job from leadership down. How do you make sure you take people through with them on that journey? The most important people is going to be your people leaders, as well as your CIO, as well as the people who have access to the money. But the audience around the table, you need to make sure you tailor your plan. So from a finance perspective, how much does it cost? What is it going to do? And what's the return going to be? From your people perspective, what skills do we need? What density of talent do we need to look for? And again, this piece about setting the tone, your leaders need to understand what you're trying to achieve. Otherwise, we'll end up with a situation where you overinvest, underestimate, and end up with something that doesn't pay back. But having that clear vision, foster collaboration, understand how you're going to measure and adapt it, and understand the data you have about what the AI is going to do. And here's a controversial point. AI is not new. People think it is because of ChatGPT and Claude and all the others. It's been around for a while, but it's just become the forefront because of the advances in technology and data and processing power. But actually, machine learning is another way to describe it, and people have been using that for years. So there's nothing to be afraid of here, but there seems to be a lot of work that needs to be explaining what it is, what it can do, what your organization needs to do with it. Carole, over to you. Please feel free to add on to that.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. And very similar thoughts. I think you mentioned the word empathy, which goes back to the whole reason we're here in terms of the culture that you've got, right? So I think going back to Jodie's question, hi Jodie, by the way, that human empathy, I think, is what AI won't be able to replace, particularly during sort of emotionally charged interactions. If you think about within financial services, you've got the Consumer Duty Act at the moment, and there's a big focus, quite rightly so, on vulnerability. So being able to understand when your customers are vulnerable, that for me is, it's great to help identify that vulnerability, but I think you need that human empathy in terms of how you're dealing with it. So I think that's a great point that you picked up.
Carole, just to come in on that one, sorry, I think this is something I was taught when I started my career in Dixon's. People buy from people they like.
Absolutely.
And I think the way you treat people means whether they like your brand or enjoy working with your brand. And some of that cannot be replicated today. I'll never say never when it comes to AI adoption. And I think that's a really interesting thing to consider here, the empathy piece. And it's one of those things, well, you need to be authentic and empathize with the customer. And some customers want that. Some customers want efficiency and service that works and make sure that they feel as though they're being looked after in the right way. And some of that's through AI and some of it's through personal service. But, people buy from people they like or like dealing with people they like, and then they will tell their friends. Right.
Exactly.
So
and it's not necessarily about what you say, Rich, and you'll know this as well. It's not what you say, it's about how you make people feel. People will always remember that. Are you going to get that same feeling from a chatbot that you are from Carole that served you either face to face or on the telephone? I also think, coming back to the third question about in terms of what's the new skills that leaders might need, and it's not just about using AI, because everyone uses AI without them realizing it sometimes, but actually leaders, I think, are now going to be needed to help design and govern it as well, because there's a whole ethical thing there that we need to think about. So we're using data at the moment to personalize things for customers. But for me, the leader of the future then needs to think about the ethical data stewardship, if you like, in terms of how are we using it in the right way, particularly if you work in an environment with regulation. And I think finally, the one from me, I guess, instead of reacting to dashboards, what a lot of people do today, leaders need to be orchestrating sort of like AI assisted decision systems, if you like. I know that sounds like a lot of jumbled words there, but don't just use it to react to the dashboard. You need action orientated insight. And I think the leaders, with the support of AI, need to make sure they're driving that agenda.
Thank you. As both of you talking, we ran another poll, and it's not surprising to see the reaction to where people are on the adoption curve. There's sort of half the audience are in that journey of early sort of experiments with mixed success. So these comments, I think, I'm sure they're resonating. If I had to just compliment what both of you said, and particularly, I think, Jody, again, thank you for some brilliant questions. And I'll just compliment, I think, on question 2, where it talks about what is the one customer pain point you believe will not be solved by AI. I still believe one of the fundamental things organizations think about, if you really want to be on top of the customer journey, is how do you address the organizational silos and the decision making. That's not something AI is going to automatically solve for you. The ability, if you take a simple topic like how are you going to approach a refund discussion, are you really joined up as to where the internal issue lies and who's going to resolve it, and how quickly can you drive that outcome back. Those are actually policy, procedure, process discussions, and an opportunity, I think, to address some of the silos. If you truly want to be obsessed about the consumer is interacting with you potentially in 24 hours across 6 channels, might be in store, might have gone online, might have left something on Trustpilot. Are you really able to address that? I think decision making. I think that's something, still comes back to fundamentals on how you think about your organization culture and your approach to the consumer. And I think interesting reflection, Carole, on the skills for CX leaders. What we are finding in our interaction with particularly lots of digital native companies and stuff right now who want to really obsess about this topic is traditionally CX leaders or even CS, customer service leaders, have often been seen as a cost center or about just trying, but they're increasingly a source of real insight that can orchestrate a conversation between brand teams and sales teams and e-commerce teams and supply chain teams, and actually be a connecting tissue to say, well, this is the true voice of the consumer. how do all the parts of the organization come together to do something about it? I actually feel the CX leaders of future, with the right level of insight and data available to them, can be really impactful to the chief commerce customer officer or even to the CEO to influence growth, vis-a-vis purely being often seen as the cost center or a capability center for the wider organization. I think sort of leading from there also, maybe I'm going to blend that the question that Jody also put in the first one, which is how can AI reshape customer trust and retention? Sometimes I feel, and these days, I don't know what your feeling is, but sometimes when you get onto try to reach out a particular brand, you take a deep sigh as you hit that first chatbot, and you just don't know how intelligent or not it's going to be, and you're just waiting to get to a human. And I don't know whether all these recent investments are actually leading to customer trust and retention, or going a couple of steps backward. But one of the things you talk about very passionately, Carole, is also thinking about this big silent majority. And potentially what AI really allows us is to tap into that silent majority in a very interesting way. So I'd love for you to maybe double click on that and tell us a bit more on that.
Yeah, so let me, so I often use this phrase silent majority. So traditionally, organizations rely on surveys, complaints, focus groups, but the reality is only a small percentage of customers actually give feedback. And those that do tend to give feedback are really happy or really unhappy. And also there's a demographic in there as well. There's only a certain type of person that's happy to fill out the surveys, make the effort to complain. Most customers actually don't. If I think, I'm happy to fill out a survey, my 21-year-old son wouldn't it? No, absolutely. He hasn't got the time to do that. He's got no interest in doing that. So that means that organisations are often basing decisions on the vocal minority, while the silent majority, i.e. the rest of the people that go about their business day to day, who may have very different needs or frustrations, go completely unheard. So this is where AI fundamentally can change the game. So it can analyze vast unstructured data. It can review all of your conversations in your call centers, call transcripts, chat logs, browsing behavior, any emails. It can even look at things like Trustpilot, Google reviews and stuff like that. And it can identify the unspoken sentiment. So frustration that isn't explicitly stated as a hesitation, confusion, particularly when you think about, this is about retention, right? So holding on to the customers that you got. What about the customers you're trying to attract? A new customer, if they can't do business with you, are not going to make the effort to fill out a survey or to make a complaint. They're just going to take their business to the next available company that is happy to do business with them. So it's really important that you listen to that unspoken sentiment. It can also pick up emerging issues, so signals that haven't yet resulted in complaints but are already impacting your experience. It might be a little niggle, but the little niggles are the things that can turn into big complaints ultimately. And I guess there's some silent churn indicators that you can also start looking at. So behaviours that a customer shows that they've been unhappy a long time before they do that. So how do you predict that behaviour? In the same way that many organisations, again, I'm using financial services a lot here, can predict when they believe a customer might go into overdraft, might start to see some financial distress because they see the signs. How can you start to predict those signs as well through frustration because you're not delivering great customer experience? So AI can then give the organisation access to the real voice of the customer across the spectrum, not just one that fills in the survey. And what's even more powerful, that it gives voices to the customers who typically stay silent without them even realising that they're giving those frustrations. So, and it can detect things like your drop-off is in your journeys. So why are people dropping out of the journeys? Now, the product team might understand that. The complaints team might understand that, but therefore are those two teams, how do you connect those teams to understand the right data points throughout the organisation? People that are going on your website and they're going through loops, they're filling out a form and then halfway through the form, for whatever reason, it's not being accepted. The same repeat callers. Why are these customers? These are the costs that the finance team will be well aware of, but why do those customers continue to call up? It's because they're not getting the answer on the first interaction with you. So this means that AI can help design for everyone, not just the vocal few. And AI for me isn't just about automation, it's also about amplification. So how do you amplify the voices we've historically missed, uncovering the needs that you never were articulated about because you never knew about them, and giving the organisation a far more complete view of that customer reality? It's an absolute game changer.
So well said, Carole. Richard, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think just taking a step back for a second, I think the amplification piece, what resonates with me there, Carole. I think we all know, if you've been a commercial leader or have P&L accountability, where one of the frustrations is you spend a lot of money getting the customers to come to your shop window, which could be your website or actually your shop, and then they abandon and leave. And you don't know they've gone because they've come in and not purchased anything because either your systems or because you're not measuring it in the right way. And therefore, AI from a customer experience perspective and measuring it is fantastic, and you're going to improve every experience. But every moment of interaction with the customer is a moment to earn loyalty. And if that interaction is a positive one, that can, and particularly when you look around the table to your commercial teams and your finance team, particularly when you're looking for investment, this can support your growth pillar. This growth opportunity, as well as doing the right thing for your customers and talking to them the right way and giving great service, that then leads to more loyalty, more conversion, and better sales outcomes for customers. So I think the commercial piece here, as well as great customer experience, understanding what they're saying, is enormous. The opportunity is massive. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that opportunity to create that loyalty by creating great experiences. And some of it's very basic. Some of it is customers arriving on your website that you can use to get eye tracking or mouse tracking to see what they do, and identify where there are gaps in your journeys, not only for servicing opportunities, but also for sales opportunities as well. And it's making sure the balance between the two of those things works also.
You're absolutely right, Richard. The commercial opportunity is huge. And Carole, I think that the point around silent majority, what I personally reflect on is that, again, it's people probably understand this, have understood this point intellectually, but what I think truly what AI unlocks is the ability to do this if you have the right intentions to tune into that silent majority, listen, understand, and amplify. The economics of that have also really made it affordable. Like, 5 years back, you to do this, you wouldn't be able to easily execute this even with the right desire or intention. And this is the real, I think, the possibilities, I think, of really intentionally deploying AI to tune into that silent majority and then really drive it. The commercial is there, but I candidly see a very small fraction of brands across sectors, not just in financial services, but retail and others, really honing in on this. So again, my view is that the opportunity is absolutely there for the taking, but I think I'd count on my hands few enterprises, and typically the more disruptive digitally native companies are actually embracing this just because they have lesser baggage. Again, and I think in bigger enterprises, I've yet to come across really enterprises that who really deploy this capability at scale. I'm sure they're out there, but I think they're few and far between.
Agreed.
So,
yeah.
just before we move on, we've just had that second poll come up, which talks about cultural barriers, right? Low cross-functional alignment and limited customer experience capability. That resonates with me really loudly. I think that low cross-functional alignment. There's an EY survey that was done across. It was financial services based, but I imagine it could be sector agnostic, where you have different views from different people or roles within the organization. So I'll take a couple of examples where I worry that AI will be used by my organization to look at the way customers think and feel. 87% of COOs say that's a really big deal, whereas it's less than half for other functions like CIO, Chief Risk Officer, and Chief Technology Officers. That alignment piece and education piece is critical. And also that customer experience capability and ownership. Almost a third of financial services companies have limited or very low control to ensure AI is free from bias. And that creates issues around regulation. But that's not just for FS companies, it's across the piece. So looking at the cultural barriers is about education, it's about control, it's about taking everybody with you. And that piece around customer experience or regulation or risk or commercial return, that's to make sure that you look at both the customer experience capability and also the AI capability and how that's going to make a difference to your business as well, would be my view.
Well said, Richard. And as we draw this, towards a close, there's one other, interesting use case I wanted to just explore and start with you, Carole. And and I think it touches on the question that was asked as well about how can you really, move the needle on customer trust and retention. And I think it's as you frame it, it's about closing the loop and driving action quickly and consistently, right? And it's this lovely phrase that you coined, Carole, about, you said, we did, that sort of builds that foundation of trust with that consumer if you do that day in, day out consistently. Can you unpack this for our viewers a bit more, Carole?
Yeah, for me, closed loop feedback is really, really simple, but very few organizations do it and do it well. So it's about giving the customer feedback, the organization responds quickly, they resolve the issue, and then uses that issue then to improve the underlying experience. Where it's really powerful is you then go back to the customer to say, we fixed your issue. Now that might be a complaint, and they would expect that from a complaint. But imagine if a customer then also has an idea or something, you go back and say, as a result of the feedback that you've given us, we've now been able to implement that for all of our customers. How powerful, and you can celebrate that in whichever way you want for that particular customer, but how powerful is that for the customer? The customer feels like they're really, really part of your organization. And going back to what Rich was saying earlier, particularly if you work for a member-led organization, they own the organization, so therefore they should feel part of that. So it really helps frontline teams. They get real insights into what the customers need. They can follow up directly. Means that issues get fixed early because you're spotting it quickly, and then they can escalate it before it escalates into a complaint or a churn. They can really nail it. I think closed loop feedback shouldn't just be for customers as well. It's also colleagues. Go back to what we've talked about at the top of the meeting in terms of actually getting for closed loop feedback for your colleagues as well, in terms of how they're dealing with it. Again, they like to know that they're being listened to because they're the ones that are dealing with your customers every single day. It helps managers and operational leaders because they can then see the patterns from the closed loop cases. It helps protect the product and the service teams. So instead of guessing, what's the one I need to fix? I've got a list of 100 things to fix. I'm not quite sure. Don't worry, your customers and colleagues will tell you how to prioritize that list based on, the AI that's coming out across your silent majority, as well as through what your customer feedback is. They get some real clear evidence-based signals about what matters most to customers. It supports the insights teams. It's really highly actionable. So for me, it's something they can really go after. It connects feedback to behaviors, not just a process, root causes, outcomes. And again, if you're working in a regulated environment, that's really, really important. And it shows the organization, coming back to the whole thing about culture, that the real value of listening to the customers, and the customers feel like they're being listened to. They feel like they're being heard. They feel valued and respected. So again, coming back to Rich mentioned earlier about sometimes the more senior people can forget the basics. So for me, the higher up the food chain that you get sometimes in an organization, the further away from the customer you get. So for me, all levels of the organization should be involved in that, dealing with those customers and making sure they're closing the loop, whether you be junior or senior. That's really, really important. And I think over time, this approach creates a sort of measurable lift in all of the measures that you might be, whether it be NPS, CSAT, complaint reduction, all of that type of stuff, because you're actually tackling the issues customers really, really care about. So for me, closed loop feedback, is an absolute another game changer, but very few organizations do it and do it well, unfortunately.
And I was reflecting just on the recent, trading period of Black Friday and others, and I own personal consumer experience where I had some glitches, etc. Again, it's hard to do this consistently and well, and that was evident in my own personal consumer experience, and also brands I think we've been working with. It is one back to the what the poll indicated. It does require a very high degree of cross-team alignment to be able to really rapidly close the loop within minutes, within hours and days. Again, the technology is available, but unless we address all the other aspects that both of you have so elegantly covered, you can't. But the prize, as Richard said, for commercial growth, if you are seen as one of those brands that can do this day in, day out consistently, that creates dependability, therefore creates trust, and therefore creates ultimate loyalty. It doesn't require, lots of marketing, outbound promotions and campaigns. It's these fundamentals that actually, build long-term trust and loyalty. It's been absolutely fascinating to unpack this topic that we're all really passionate about. It comes back to, in many ways, good old structured common sense, but again, to reemphasize, doing this well in organizations is actually hard yards, because we're dealing with people, we're dealing with established organization structures, we're dealing with some of the fundamentals of change. And again, I come back to, I think it really remains that red thread culture that can really drive outstanding customer experience, not just tooling, not just a good strategy. All of these aspects sort of bit like Lego bricks coming together and creating magic. So I think we'll end on that tone of culture being a red thread, culture being that magic. And on that note, I want to thank all our viewers to have sort of tuned in. We will share the recording with all of you. And my heartfelt thanks to both you, Carole and Richard, for taking time, engaging and really sharing, what is real world practical experience, from years of actually being on multiple sides. So thank you so much for being on the webinar today. Thank you everybody for tuning in. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Retention Voices.
Thanks, Vivek. Thanks, everyone.